Chapter 1. Altitude. Gary Conley checked his watch as he walked through the employee entrance of Denver International Airport. 4:47 a.m. 17 years of flying commercial jets had trained his body to function on impossible schedules, but lately, something felt off. Not fatigue. Something deeper, more unsettling. At 42, Gary had the life he'd always wanted. Senior captain for Apex Airlines, over 12,000 flight hours logged, and a reputation as one of the smoothest pilots in the industry. His colleagues called him Steady Gary, a nickname he'd earned after successfully landing a plane with failing hydraulics 3 years ago, saving 287 lives. The airline had given him a commendation. The passengers had given him a standing ovation when they finally deplaned, 5 hours late, but alive. But success in the cockpit hadn't translated to clarity at home. He grabbed his flight bag from his locker, his mind drifting to yesterday morning. He'd woken up disoriented, his alarm blaring at 2 p.m. instead of 6 a.m. Roxanne, his wife of 8 years, had been sitting at the kitchen counter, her expression somewhere between concern and something else, something he couldn't quite read. "You changed the alarm again," she'd said softly. "Gary, this is the 3rd time this month. Maybe you should talk to someone. The stress of flying, the irregular hours, it's affecting you." He'd stared at his phone, confused. He never changed his alarm. Never. "I didn't." "You did, honey. You just don't remember." She'd placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch cool. "Dr. Hammond said this could happen. The sleep deprivation, the pressure. Maybe it's time to consider grounding yourself for a while." Dr. Hammond. The psychiatrist Roxanne had insisted he see 2 months ago after he'd supposedly forgotten an entire conversation about refinancing their house. Except Gary remembered that conversation perfectly. It had never happened. But the doctor's notes said otherwise, written in clinical language that made him sound unstable. Gary shook off the memory and headed toward the crew briefing room. Flight 2847 to Miami. A routine 5-hour journey he'd flown hundreds of times. His co-pilot, Nate Pugh, was already there, reviewing weather reports. Nate was 29, eager and competent enough to handle most situations. "Morning, Captain. Looks like smooth sailing today. Clear skies most of the way." "Let's hope so." Gary settled into his chair, scanning the passenger manifest out of habit. His eyes stopped on 2 names in first class, Maurice Devine and Roxanne Conley. His blood went cold. "Everything okay, Captain?" Nate asked. Gary forced his face into neutral. "Fine. Just checking something." Roxanne had told him she was visiting her sister in Boulder this weekend. Her sister, Cora Nicholson, who lived in a modest apartment and worked as a school teacher. There was no reason for Roxanne to be on a flight to Miami. No reason to be in first class. They flew standby for free in coach as a benefit of his employment. And Maurice Devine. Gary knew that name. Maurice was a real estate developer, someone Roxanne had mentioned working with on a charity event 6 months ago. "Just fundraising stuff," she'd said dismissively when Gary asked about it. He pulled out his phone under the table and texted Roxanne. "Hope you're having fun with Cora. Love you." The reply came within seconds. "Already here. She's taking me to this cute cafe. Love you too. Red heart." Gary stared at the message. Then he looked back at the manifest. Roxanne Conley, seat 2A. Maurice Devine, seat 2B. His wife was lying. And in 45 minutes, she'd be on his plane. Chapter 2. Departure. Gary went through pre-flight checks on autopilot, his mind racing. Nate handled most of the communication with ground control, while Gary tried to piece together the last few months. The memory gaps. The doctor's appointments Roxanne had scheduled without consulting him. The way she'd started managing their finances more aggressively, insisting he sign documents to protect them both that he'd barely had time to review between flights. And Maurice Devine kept appearing in their lives. At their anniversary dinner. What a coincidence, Roxanne had exclaimed when Maurice approached their table. At the gym where Gary worked out, Maurice had suddenly joined, always friendly, always asking about aviation, about Gary's schedule, about his health. "Captain, we're cleared for pushback," Nate's voice cut through his thoughts. "Copy that." Gary's hands moved through the familiar motions, but his mind was elsewhere. He'd met Roxanne 9 years ago at a hospital benefit. She'd been volunteering, radiant in a blue dress, her laugh infectious. She worked in pharmaceutical sales, successful and driven. Their courtship had been a whirlwind. She understood his chaotic schedule, never complained about the nights alone, and seemed genuinely excited about building a life together. 3 years into their marriage, Gary's father had died, leaving him a substantial inheritance, nearly $2 million from a lifetime of careful investments and a generous life insurance policy. Roxanne had been supportive, helping him set up trusts and investment accounts. "We need to be smart about this," she'd said. "Protect your future. Protect our future." Within a year, most of it had been moved into joint accounts or investments that Roxanne managed. "You're busy flying," she'd reasoned. "Let me handle the boring financial stuff." Gary had been grateful. Now, he wondered if he'd been stupid. The Boeing 737 lifted smoothly into the dawn sky. As they reached cruising altitude, Gary unbuckled and stood. "I'm going to walk the cabin," he told Nate. "Make sure everything's settled." Nate looked surprised. Captains rarely did cabin walks, but nodded. "Copy that." Gary stepped out of the cockpit, his heartbeat loud in his ears. The galley was busy with flight attendants preparing for beverage service. He recognized Janice Matthews, the senior attendant he'd flown with dozens of times. "Captain Conley." She greeted him with a professional smile. "Everything all right? Just checking in. How's first class?" "Quiet so far. We have 12 passengers, most of them sleeping or working." She paused. "Though I did notice Mrs. Conley is on board." "I didn't realize." "She didn't tell me." Gary interrupted, his voice level. "What seat?" "2A, sir." "With a companion." Janice's expression shifted slightly, something knowing in her eyes that made Gary's stomach tighten. He moved toward the first-class cabin but stopped at the curtain divider, a sudden instinct telling him not to reveal himself yet. Instead, he positioned himself just out of sight, where he could hear voices from the premium section. "Exactly 90 minutes after we land," a male voice was saying. "Maurice Devine. The dosage has to be precise. Too much and they'll detect it in the autopsy." Gary's body went rigid. "I know," Roxanne's voice irritated. "I've been doing this for 8 months, Maurice. I know the dosage. The psychiatrist's records already establish a pattern of cognitive decline. The changed alarms, the forgotten conversations, it's all documented. And the new will. Signed last week." He didn't even read it carefully, just trusted me like always. "Everything goes to me, with you as the executor. No family to contest it except that bitch sister of his, and she's barely spoken to Gary in years over some stupid argument." Gary's vision blurred. His sister, Georgia Burke, had tried to warn him about Roxanne 2 years ago. They'd fought. He'd chosen his wife. They hadn't spoken since. "The important thing," Maurice continued, "is that it looks natural. A heart attack at 42 isn't that unusual for someone under stress. The life insurance pays double for accidental death, but we can't risk that scrutiny. Natural causes, stress-related." "Stop worrying," Roxanne cut him off. "After today's flight, we start the final phase. Increased dose in his coffee every morning. Mix it with his blood pressure medication he doesn't even need but thinks he does. For weeks, maybe 5, and Captain Steady Gary Conley will have a fatal cardiac event in his sleep. Tragic. Sudden. And I'll be the grieving widow of a hero pilot." "What about the kid?" Gary's heart stopped. They didn't have children. Roxanne had always said she wasn't ready. "What kid?" Roxanne's voice turned sharp. "I thought you mentioned." "There is no kid, Maurice. I made sure of that. Went on birth control the day after we got married and told him I was trying. Why would I want his brat complicating things?" The casual cruelty in her voice was like a physical blow. "Once we have the money," Roxanne continued, "we're gone. Your development in the Caymans, purchased with his inheritance money that he so stupidly gave me access to. Untraceable. We'll wait a respectable 18 months. Then you and I get married in paradise. $2 million, the insurance payout, and the equity in his house. We're talking almost $4 million total." To Gary Conley, Maurice said, and Gary heard the clink of glasses. The perfect mark. Gary stood frozen in the galley, his mind struggling to process what he'd just heard. His wife, the woman he'd loved, trusted, built a life with, was systematically poisoning him, planning his murder. And Maurice Devine wasn't just her affair partner. He was her co-conspirator. "Captain." Janice's voice was soft beside him. "Sir, you're shaking." He looked down. His hands were trembling, his breath coming in short gasps. But as he met Janice's concerned gaze, something shifted inside him. The shock began crystallizing into something else. Something colder. Sharper. Janice, he said quietly, I need you to listen very carefully. Chapter 3, The Evidence. Gary stepped back into the cockpit, his mind working through scenarios with the same methodical precision he used during emergency procedures. Nate glanced over, noticed something in Gary's expression, and wisely kept quiet. For hours until landing. For hours to build an airtight case. He pulled out his phone and enabled the voice recording app, then headed back to the galley. Janice was waiting, her face pale with concern. Captain, what's happening? That woman in 2A, my wife, she and the man in 2B are planning to murder me, Gary said calmly. I just heard them discussing it. I need your help, but if you say no, I understand. This could get complicated. Janice's eyes widened, but she didn't question him. After 17 years of flying, she knew Gary Conley wasn't the type to make wild accusations. What do you need? Your phone. I'm going to record their conversation. My phone is linked to too many accounts Roxanne can access. I need something clean. She handed it over without hesitation, and Gary quickly set up a new recording app with a cloud backup to his sister's email, the one account Roxanne didn't know about. For the next 2 hours, Gary made multiple trips past first class, phone concealed, recording fragments of conversation. Maurice and Roxanne were shockingly careless at 35,000 feet, apparently confident that Gary was safely locked in the cockpit. He caught Maurice saying, "The psychiatrist was expensive, but worth it. Having official documentation of his mental decline makes everything cleaner." And Roxanne, "I switched his vitamins for blood pressure medication 3 months ago. He actually thanked me for being so health conscious. God, he's pathetic." Later, "Remember, once he's dead, act devastated for at least 6 months. Sell the house, but keep the photographs. People love a grieving widow who honors her dead husband's memory." Gary also quietly photographed their drinks, champagne, expensive, and made a note of how comfortable they were with each other. The way Morris's hand rested on Roxanne's knee. The intimate way she leaned into him. 8 years of his life. All a calculated lie. Back in the cockpit, Gary pulled up his email on Nate's laptop, another device Roxanne couldn't access, and started composing messages. First, to his sister Georgia. "Georgia, I know we haven't spoken in 2 years, and you were right about Roxanne. I'm emailing you evidence of a conspiracy to murder me. Please forward everything to the FBI and to attorney Ernest Dillon in Denver, Dad's old lawyer. I'm sorry I didn't listen to you. I love you. Gary." He attached the audio files and photographs. Then he contacted Randolph Wagner, an old Air Force buddy who'd become a private investigator. "Randy, emergency. Need complete background on Maurice Devine and Roxanne Pace. Maiden name. Everything. Financial records, communication logs, everything you can find legally or otherwise. We'll pay triple your rate." The reply came within minutes. "On it. Give me 2 hours." Gary then did something that felt surreal but necessary. He logged into their joint bank accounts. Roxanne had always discouraged him from checking them regularly. Why stress yourself? I've got it handled, but he had access. What he found made his blood boil. Over the past 8 months, Roxanne had been systematically draining their accounts. Small transfers at first, $5,000 here, $10,000 there, to an offshore account in her name only. Then larger chunks. His father's inheritance, which should have been nearly $1.8 million, was down to $340,000. The rest had been invested in Maurice Devine's real estate ventures. Ventures that, according to a quick Google search, didn't actually exist. The company website was professional looking but led nowhere. The business address was a UPS store in Fort Lauderdale. Gary took screenshots of everything. 90 minutes before landing, Randy's report came through. It was damning. Maurice Devine had a record, insurance fraud, identity theft, charges that had been mysteriously dropped. And his real name was Maurice Taylor. Devine was an alias he'd adopted 5 years ago after serving 18 months for embezzlement. More damning. Phone records showed Roxanne and Maurice had been in contact for nearly 2 years, a year before the charity event, where she'd claimed they'd first met. They'd been planning this long before Gary's father had died. They'd just been waiting for the inheritance. The psychiatrist, Dr. Hammond, was real but had recently filed for bankruptcy. A large cash payment from an anonymous donor had appeared in his accounts 3 months ago, the same amount Gary had paid for his sessions. Everything was a setup. His marriage, his medical records, his declining mental state, all fabricated. Gary looked at the evidence on the screen, and something inside him shifted. He'd spent his whole life being responsible, playing by the rules, being the steady one everyone could count on. Where had that gotten him? Married to a woman trying to poison him for his inheritance. No more playing by the rules. He called the Miami-Dade Aviation Police, asking for Sergeant Antonio Nolan, whom he'd met during a security conference 2 years ago. Gary Conley. Been a while. What's up? Antonio, I need a favor. I'm landing at MIA in 70 minutes with evidence of a murder conspiracy. I need police presence at the gate, but I need it to look routine. Can you do that without tipping anyone off? How serious are we talking? My wife and her accomplice are planning to poison me for a $2 million inheritance. I have audio recordings, financial records, and I'm going to need protective custody. A pause. Jesus. Yeah, I'll make it happen. Gate 47. Correct. We'll be ready. Gary took a breath, then made one more call to the CEO of Apex Airlines, a man named Spencer Wu who'd been Gary's mentor when he'd started flying commercial. Gary? Isn't this your flight time? Spencer, I need you to trust me. When I land in Miami, I'm going to request the airport be secured. I have evidence of a crime that occurred in flight, and I need police presence before passengers deplane. What kind of crime? Conspiracy to commit murder. The perpetrators are on my plane. Spencer was quiet for a long moment. You're serious? Completely. And Spencer? One of them is my wife. Christ. Okay. I trust you, Gary. Do what you need to do. As Gary began the descent into Miami, he made an announcement over the intercom, his voice steady and professional. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Conley. We're beginning our descent into Miami International Airport. For security reasons, all passengers will need to remain seated after landing until cleared by airport authorities. This is standard procedure. We apologize for any inconvenience. In first class, Roxanne looked up from her magazine, unconcerned. She had no idea what was coming. Chapter 4. Landing. The plane touched down smoothly at 11:42 a.m. As Gary taxied toward the gate, he could see the police vehicles, subtle but unmistakable if you knew where to look. 3 unmarked cars, positioned strategically. Antonio had come through. Nate, Gary said calmly, I need you to follow my lead here. What's about to happen is going to seem unusual, but I need you to trust me. The younger pilot's eyes widened. Captain, just trust me. Gary brought the plane to a stop at the gate, but didn't shut down the engines immediately. He picked up the PA system again. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We're experiencing a brief security delay. Airport personnel will be boarding momentarily. He could see confusion rippling through the cabin on the monitors. Passengers checking their phones, murmuring to each other. Then he opened the cockpit door and walked back to first class, Janice trailing behind him with her phone, still recording. Gary stepped through the curtain. Roxanne's face went white when she saw him. Gary? What are you? You're supposed to be flying the plane. Autopilot is a wonderful thing, Gary said pleasantly. He looked at Maurice, whose expression had shifted from surprise to calculation. Maurice Devine. Or should I say Maurice Taylor? The insurance fraud conviction was a nice touch. Morris's hand moved toward his pocket, but Gary was faster, his own hand emerging with a small canister. Pepper spray. Perfectly legal for pilots to carry. TSA approved. Don't make me use it. Gary, what is this? Roxanne's voice was shrill now, panicked. Other first-class passengers were watching, some with their phones out. You're scaring me. This is what Dr. Hammond warned us about. The paranoia, the delusions. The delusions, Gary interrupted, his voice cutting. That you and your boyfriend have been poisoning me for 8 months? That you forged psychiatric records to make me look mentally unfit? That you've stolen nearly $1.5 million of my inheritance? Those delusions. The color drained from her face. Or maybe, Gary continued, pulling out Janice's phone and hitting play. You'd like to explain this delusion. His own voice filled the cabin, the recorded conversation from 2 hours earlier. Roxanne's voice saying, exactly 90 minutes after we land, the dosage has to be precise. Too much and they'll detect it in the autopsy. Passengers gasped. Someone screamed. Maurice lunged from his seat, but Gary had anticipated it, his Air Force training kicking in as he sidestepped and drove an elbow into Morris's solar plexus. The man went down hard, gasping. Stay down, Gary said coldly. The cockpit door opened and Antonio Nolan appeared, 3 officers behind him, weapons drawn. Gary Conley? That's me. These are your suspects. Maurice Taylor, alias Maurice Devine, wanted for fraud. And Roxanne Pace Conley, conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, fraud, theft. You can't, Roxanne started, but Antonio cut her off. Ma'am, please stand up slowly. You're under arrest. This is insane, Roxanne shrieked as an officer pulled her hands behind her back. He's mentally ill, asked Dr. Hammond. Gary's been having episodes, blackouts. This is a breakdown. Actually, Gary said, pulling out his phone and showing Antonio the screenshots of bank transfers. This is evidence of systematic financial fraud. And these, he showed the audio files, are recordings of you discussing my murder. And this, he handed over a small pill bottle, is what you've been putting in my coffee. I switched the bottles 2 weeks ago when I first started getting suspicious. The pills you've been taking yourself are Tic Tacs. The ones you were giving me are in this bottle. I'm guessing talk screens will show some interesting combinations. Antonio took the bottle, his expression grim. We'll need full statements. I have everything, Gary said. Bank records, phone logs, audio recordings, a full report from a licensed private investigator. And he gestured to the passengers watching in stunned silence. About 40 witnesses who just heard a confession played over the PA system. Maurice was cuffed now, his face purple with rage. You stupid son of a, you think this is over? You think you've won? No, Gary said quietly. I know I've won. Because I'm walking off this plane. And you're going to federal prison. As officers led Roxanne and Maurice away, both screaming threats and denials, Gary felt a hand on his shoulder. Janice was crying. Captain, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry this happened to you. Don't be, Gary said. And for the first time in months, he felt something like peace. I'm not dead. They failed. And now everyone knows what they are. The airport had been secured, passengers were being interviewed as witnesses, and Gary gave his full statement to Antonio in a private room. Every detail, every piece of evidence, laid out with the precision of a flight plan. When it was done, Antonio leaned back in his chair. In 20 years of law enforcement, I've never seen a victim build a case this thoroughly while his life was actively in danger. You're either crazy brave or just crazy. 6 months ago, I would have said the second one, Gary admitted. They almost convinced me I was losing my mind. But somewhere along the way, I started trusting my gut again. And my gut said I wasn't crazy. I was being gaslit. The DA is going to love this case, Antonio said. With the evidence you've collected, this is slam dunk. Attempted murder, conspiracy, fraud. They're looking at 20 years minimum, probably more. Good, Gary said. Then his phone buzzed. His sister Georgia. Got your email. On a flight to Miami now. Don't do anything stupid until I get there. I love you. I'm sorry I let you push me away. Gary typed back. Nothing stupid left to do. They're in custody. I love you too. I'm sorry I didn't listen. Chapter 5, Revelations. 3 days later, Gary sat in attorney Ernest Dillon's office in Denver, his sister Georgia beside him. The lawyer was 73, sharp as ever, and had been quietly investigating Gary's situation since receiving Georgia's frantic call. The good news, Ernest said, spreading documents across his massive oak desk, is that we can recover most of your assets. The transfers to offshore accounts can be traced and reversed through litigation. Morris's company was a shell. The money is still sitting there, just not accessible to you at the moment. And the bad news? Your wife was more thorough than we initially thought. Ernest pulled out a thick file. She had access to everything, your retirement accounts, your insurance beneficiaries, even your medical records. She'd been systematically documenting false symptoms for months, building a paper trail that would have supported an incompetency claim if anyone had questioned your death. George's hand tightened on Gary's arm. She was 45, a high school vice principal in Seattle, with their father's same direct gaze. How did we not see this? How did I not push harder? You tried, Gary said quietly. I didn't listen. Roxanne Pace had a history, Ernest continued. This wasn't her first con. Randolph Wagner's investigation uncovered 2 previous relationships, both with wealthy, older men. One died of a sudden heart attack at 53. The other developed early-onset dementia at 60 and signed over his assets before his family could intervene. Both cases were investigated but never prosecuted due to lack of evidence. She's done this before? Gary's voice was hollow. Multiple times. Maurice Taylor was her partner in at least 2 of these schemes. They've been running this operation for nearly a decade. You were just the latest mark, but the first one who figured it out in time. Gary stood and walked to the window, looking out over Denver's skyline. The city where he'd built his life, his career, his marriage, all of it built on lies. What's the prosecution timeline? Federal charges are being filed today. Colorado state charges for fraud and theft will follow. The DA in Miami is pushing for attempted murder in the first degree. With your evidence and witness testimony, they're likely to take a plea deal, but the prosecution wants them to serve significant time. How long? 15 to 25 years each, if they're convicted on all charges. And they will be. Your evidence is airtight. Gary nodded slowly. I want to be there. For every hearing, every trial date. I want them to see my face and know they failed. We'll make sure you're notified, Ernest assured him. After the meeting, Georgia insisted on buying Gary dinner at their father's favorite restaurant, a steakhouse near the airport where the old man had celebrated every promotion, every milestone. Dad would be proud of you, Georgia said, raising her beer. The way you handled this. Most people would have fallen apart. I almost did, Gary admitted. For a while, I believed them. I thought I was losing my mind. The gaps in my memory, the confusion, they manufactured all of it so perfectly. But you fought back. You trusted yourself. Gary took a long drink. I keep thinking about the 8 years. How much of it was real? Did she ever actually love me? Or was it always just a con? Georgia was quiet for a moment. Does it matter? You're alive. You won. She's going to prison. It matters, Gary said softly. Because I loved her. I trusted her with everything. And she was planning to kill me the entire time. His sister reached across the table. Then let that be your fuel. Not for revenge, you already got that, but for building something real. Finding people who actually deserve your trust. Over the next 2 weeks, more details emerged. The investigation uncovered that Dr. Hammond had been paid $50,000 to falsify Gary's psychiatric records. The doctor was now under investigation himself, his license suspended. The blood pressure medication Roxanne had been giving Gary was actually a cocktail of drugs designed to cause subtle cognitive impairment and cardiac stress. Nothing immediately fatal, but cumulatively lethal over time. The coroner estimated another 6 weeks of dosing would have resulted in a massive heart attack, likely fatal, that would have appeared natural. Randy's investigation also revealed that Maurice had been using Gary's identity to take out loans and credit cards, another $500,000 in debt that Gary hadn't known existed. All of it would need to be contested and cleared. But the most damning evidence came from Roxanne's own computer, seized during a search warrant. Email drafts titled "After Gary" that detailed their post-murder plans. Flight bookings to the Caymans. Property listings for luxury homes. Even wedding planning documents for her eventual marriage to Maurice. She'd been planning her future with his money while sleeping beside him every night. Chapter 6. The System. For weeks after the arrest, Gary returned to work. Apex Airlines had placed him on paid administrative leave, standard procedure, but Spencer Wu had been clear that Gary's job was waiting for him whenever he was ready. You're cleared for flight, Spencer said when Gary walked into his office. Psych eval, medical review, everything checks out. In fact, our psychologist said you're one of the most mentally stable people she's ever evaluated. I told her she should have met you 2 months ago when you pulled off this whole investigation while actively being poisoned. Gary managed to smile. How's the company handling the publicity? Are you kidding? You're a hero. Pilot outsmarts murder plot at 35,000 feet. We're getting booking requests specifically asking for flights you're captaining. The board wants to give you another commendation. I don't want a commendation. I just want to fly. Spencer studied him. You sure you're ready? No one would blame you for taking more time. I need to be in the air, Gary said honestly. It's the only place that still makes sense to me. His first flight back was Denver to Dallas, a short hop with Nate as his co-pilot again. The younger man was professional, but clearly walking on eggshells. You can relax, Gary finally said as they reached cruising altitude. I'm not going to snap. I'm not going to talk about what happened. I just want to fly the plane. I can't believe I didn't notice anything, Nate said quietly. They were right there, planning your murder, and I didn't. How could you have known? Gary interrupted. I didn't know until I overheard them. These people are professionals. They've done this before. You're not trained to spot sociopaths at 35,000 feet. Still, I'm sorry, Captain. Don't be. Just be a good co-pilot. That's all I need. The flight was smooth, routine, exactly what Gary needed. But when he got home, to the house he'd shared with Roxanne, now feeling empty and violated, the reality crashed back down. He walked through rooms filled with memories that now felt poisoned. The kitchen where she'd prepared his coffee every morning, laced with drugs. The bedroom where she'd slept beside him while planning his death. The office where she'd forged his signature on documents that would have left him with nothing. Georgia had offered to let him stay with her in Seattle, but Gary had refused. I'm not running from my own house. She doesn't get to take that from me too. But standing in the living room, surrounded by photographs of a marriage that had never been real, Gary felt the weight of it all. The betrayal, the violation, the sheer evil of what she'd planned. His phone rang. Ernest Dillon. Gary, there's been a development. Roxanne wants to make a deal. What kind of deal? She's willing to provide testimony against Maurice in exchange for a reduced sentence. Claims he masterminded everything, that she was coerced, that she's a victim too. Gary laughed, a harsh sound. She's trying to play victim? After everything. The DA isn't buying it. But they're required to present any plea offers to you as the primary victim. Do you want to hear her out? No. I want her to stand trial for every single charge. I want a jury to hear those recordings and see who she really is. No deals. No reduced sentences. That's what I told them you'd say, Ernest replied. Trial is set for 8 weeks from now. Are you prepared for that? It's going to be brutal. They'll try to make you look paranoid, vindictive. They'll paint her as a devoted wife driven to desperation by your mental health issues. Let them try, Gary said. I have the truth. And I have evidence they can't explain away. After hanging up, Gary sat in the darkening living room and let himself feel the anger, the deep, burning rage at what had been stolen from him. Not just money or property, but years of his life. His trust, his ability to believe in people. But beneath the anger was something else, determination. Gary Conley had survived a murder plot through intelligence, preparation, and refusing to be a victim. Now he was going to make sure everyone knew exactly what Roxanne Pace and Maurice Taylor were. And he was going to make sure they paid for every lie, every manipulation, every moment they'd made him doubt his own sanity. The trial was going to be his final revenge. And he was going to make it count. Chapter 7. The Trial. The federal courthouse in Denver was packed. Media had turned the case into a sensation. Pilot exposes murder plot at 35,000 feet, made for irresistible headlines. Gary sat in the front row, Georgia beside him, watching as Roxanne and Maurice were led into the courtroom in separate custody transports. Roxanne had lost weight, her face gaunt but carefully made up. She wore a conservative blue dress, probably chosen by her defense attorney to make her look sympathetic. When her eyes met Gary's, she quickly looked away. Maurice, on the other hand, stared directly at Gary with naked hatred. His attorney, a slick corporate lawyer named Hugo Wall, had already filed multiple motions to suppress evidence. All had been denied. The prosecution was being handled by Assistant U.S. Attorney Lucinda Sparks, a woman in her 50s with a reputation for being merciless with white-collar criminals. She'd told Gary in their prep meeting, I've prosecuted mob bosses and cartel leaders. Your wife is worse. At least they're honest about being criminals. Judge Orlando Hill, a no-nonsense jurist in his 60s, called the court to order. This is the case of United States versus Roxanne Pace Conley and Maurice Taylor. We'll begin with opening statements. Lucinda rose, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is a case about betrayal of the deepest kind. Captain Gary Conley spent 8 years married to the defendant, trusting her with his life, his finances, his future. That trust was not just broken, it was weaponized. The evidence will show that Ms. Pace Conley and her co-conspirator, Maurice Taylor, engaged in a systematic, calculated plot to murder Captain Conley and steal his inheritance. They didn't just plan to kill him. They tried to destroy his mind first, making him doubt his own sanity so that when he died, no one would question it. She paused, letting that sink in. You will hear recordings of the defendants discussing the exact dosage of poison to use. You will see financial records showing the theft of nearly $1.5 million. You will hear from medical experts about the drugs Ms. Pace Conley was secretly administering. And you will hear Captain Conley's testimony about the psychological torture of slowly believing you're losing your mind while the person you love most is orchestrating your death. Gary felt eyes on him from across the room. The jury, 8 women, for men, were already looking at him with sympathy. Roxanne's attorney, a woman named Blanca Bowman, tried a different approach in her opening statement. My client made mistakes. She had an affair, a terrible betrayal of her marriage vows. But she is not a murderer. Roxanne Pace Conley was manipulated by Maurice Taylor, a con artist with a criminal record who saw an opportunity in a vulnerable woman's unhappy marriage. You will hear evidence that Mr. Taylor orchestrated this entire scheme, using Ms. Pace Conley as his pawn. She believed she was helping her husband with his finances, not stealing from him. She believed the medications were vitamins, not poison. She is a victim here, just as much as Captain Conley. Gary nearly laughed out loud. The recordings made it crystal clear that Roxanne was an active, enthusiastic participant. Morris's lawyer took a more aggressive stance, arguing entrapment and claiming the recordings were inadmissible. Judge Hill shut that down quickly. The first week of testimony established the timeline. Georgia testified about Gary's inheritance and how Roxanne had immediately taken control of the finances. Ernest Dillon walked the jury through the fraudulent transfers and shell companies. Randy Wagner presented his investigation showing Roxanne and Morris's 2-year relationship and Morris's criminal history. Then came the medical testimony. Dr. Kent Branch, a toxicologist, explained the drug cocktail found in Gary's system. This combination, beta blockers, blood thinners, and a calcium channel blocker, would cause cumulative cardiac stress over time. The dosage was carefully calculated to avoid immediate symptoms, but to gradually weaken the heart muscle. Another 6 to 8 weeks of this regimen would have resulted in cardiac arrest, likely fatal, that would have appeared natural to a coroner not specifically looking for these compounds. And the defendant administered these drugs. According to Captain Conley's testimony and the pills recovered from his home, yes, the pills were in a bottle labeled as multivitamins, but chemical analysis shows they contained this drug cocktail. Blanca Bowman tried to argue that Roxanne didn't know what was in the pills, but Dr. Branch demolished that theory. These are prescription medications. They can't be obtained without a doctor's orders. Someone had to knowingly source these drugs and place them in that bottle. Week 2 brought the recordings. Lucinda played the full audio from the flight. Nearly 8 minutes of Roxanne and Maurice casually discussing Gary's murder, the timing, the dosage, the insurance payout. The courtroom was silent except for their voices. The important thing is that it looks natural. A heart attack at 42 isn't that unusual for someone under stress. After today's flight, we start the final phase. Captain Steady Gary Conley will have a fatal cardiac event in his sleep. Tragic, sudden, and I'll be the grieving widow of a hero pilot. When it ended, several jurors were openly crying. Roxanne sat with her head down, refusing to look at anyone. Maurice was stone-faced. Then Gary took the stand. Lucinda walked him through his testimony carefully. His marriage, his father's death, the inheritance, the strange symptoms he'd started experiencing. When did you first suspect something was wrong? When I found out Roxanne was on my flight, Gary said clearly. She told me she was visiting her sister in Boulder. But she was on my passenger manifest, flying first class with Maurice Devine. That didn't make sense. So I started paying attention. What did you hear? I heard them planning my murder. Gary's voice was steady, controlled. They were discussing the exact timing of when to increase the poison dosage. They talked about how they'd already stolen most of my inheritance. They laughed about how trusting I was, how easy I'd been to manipulate. How did that make you feel? Gary met the jury's eyes. Like I'd been sleeping next to a stranger for 8 years. Like every moment of my marriage had been a lie. But mostly, it made me angry. Angry enough to fight back. The cross-examination was brutal. Blanca Bowman tried to paint Gary as controlling, paranoid, potentially violent. Isn't it true you have military training, Captain Conley? I was in the Air Force, yes. Combat training, basic training. I was a pilot, not infantry. But you know how to physically subdue someone? Yes. Isn't it possible that you misinterpreted a private conversation between 2 people having an affair? That in your anger and jealousy, you heard what you wanted to hear to justify violence against your wife? Gary's jaw tightened. No, it's not possible. Because I have recordings. Because I have medical evidence. Because I have financial records. None of that is a misinterpretation. But you admit you were taking psychiatric medications. I was taking poison, Gary cut her off. That my wife was giving me while telling me it was vitamins. The psychiatric records were fabricated by a doctor who was bribed. All of this has been proven. The attorney tried to rattle him, but Gary had spent 17 years making life or death decisions in emergency situations. He wasn't going to be broken by courtroom theatrics. Chapter 8. The verdict. The prosecution rested after 3 weeks of testimony. The defense put up a weak case. Maurice didn't take the stand, and Roxanne's testimony was a disaster. She tried to play the abused wife, claiming Maurice had threatened her, that she'd gone along out of fear. Lucinda Sparks eviscerated her on cross-examination. Ms. Pace Conley, you testified that you were afraid of Maurice Taylor. Is that correct? Yes. Yet you were recorded laughing about your husband's impending death. Does that sound like fear to you? I was trying to placate Maurice. You said, and I quote, Captain Steady Gary Conley will have a fatal cardiac event in his sleep. Tragic. Sudden. And I'll be the grieving widow of a hero pilot. Those are your words. Were you afraid when you said that? Or were you excited about becoming a wealthy widow? Roxanne's face crumbled. I didn't mean. You also said there would be no children complicating things. You admitted going on birth control the day after you married Captain Conley and lying to him for 8 years about trying to conceive. Was Maurice forcing you to do that too? No, but... And the offshore accounts in your name only? The property listings in the Caymans? The wedding planning documents for you and Maurice? Was he forcing you to plan your future wedding while your husband was still alive? I wasn't thinking clearly. No, Miss Pace Conley. You were thinking very clearly. You were thinking about money. You were thinking about freedom. You were thinking about murder. What you weren't thinking about was consequences. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the forewoman, an older woman named Janice Matthews, coincidentally sharing the name of the flight attendant who'd helped Gary, read the verdict in a clear voice. In the case of the United States versus Roxanne Pace Conley, on the count of conspiracy to commit murder, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of attempted murder, we find the defendant guilty. On all counts of fraud, theft, and racketeering, we find the defendant guilty. Roxanne collapsed into sobs. In the case of the United States versus Maurice Taylor, on all counts, we find the defendant guilty. Morris's face went purple with rage. This is bullshit. He set us up. The judge's gavel cracked down. Order. Mr. Taylor, you will remain silent or be removed from this courtroom. Judge Hill set sentencing for 3 weeks later. When the day came, the courtroom was packed again. Both defendants had the opportunity to address the court before sentencing. Maurice refused. Roxanne stood, her voice shaking. Your Honor, I want to apologize to Gary. I made terrible mistakes. I was weak, and I hurt someone who trusted me. I take full responsibility for my actions, and I'm prepared to face the consequences. Gary almost believed her. The words were perfect, the delivery convincing. But then she glanced at Maurice, and Gary saw it. A tiny smirk, quickly hidden. She was still performing, still trying to con her way to a lighter sentence. Judge Hill wasn't fooled either. Ms. Pace Conley, I've presided over hundreds of criminal cases. I've seen remorse. What you just displayed is not remorse, it's regret that you were caught. Your testimony at trial, your behavior throughout these proceedings, and the evidence presented all show a calculating, manipulative individual who saw a trusting man as nothing more than a source of money. You didn't just betray your husband. You tried to destroy his mind before murdering him. That level of cruelty deserves the maximum sentence allowed by law. He looked down at his papers. Roxanne Pace Conley, I sentence you to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole for the first 15 years. In addition, you are ordered to make full restitution to Gary Conley in the amount of $1.8 million plus all legal fees and costs. Roxanne's face went white. Maurice Taylor, the judge continued, you have a history of preying on vulnerable people. You are a predator who uses charm and manipulation to destroy lives. I sentence you to 30 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole for the first 20 years. You are also jointly liable for the restitution order. Maurice started screaming obscenities as marshals dragged him from the courtroom. Roxanne simply stared ahead, her face blank with shock. Outside the courthouse, Gary stood with Georgia, Ernest, and Lucinda as reporters shouted questions. Captain Conley, how does it feel to get justice? Do you have anything to say to your ex-wife? What's next for you? Gary raised a hand for silence. The crowd quieted. 8 months ago, I was being systematically poisoned by someone I loved. I was being gaslit into believing I was losing my mind. My inheritance was being stolen. My life was being planned out to end in a staged heart attack. But I survived. Not because I'm special or particularly brave, because I trusted my instincts and I had help from good people. He gestured to his sister, his lawyer, his team. Justice wasn't just served today. Justice was earned through investigation, evidence, and the legal system working as it should. Roxanne Pace and Maurice Taylor are going to prison for a very long time. And I get to rebuild my life knowing that they failed. Do you have a message for other potential victims? Gary thought for a moment. Trust your gut. If something feels wrong, it probably is. And don't be afraid to fight back. You're stronger than you think. Chapter 9, Altitude. 6 months later, Gary stood in his new apartment, a modern high-rise overlooking Denver with no memories of Roxanne attached to it. He'd sold the house, recovered most of his inheritance through court-ordered restitution, and started the process of rebuilding. His phone rang. Georgia. Hey, big brother. How are you? Good, Gary said, and meant it. Really good. I'm proud of you. Dad would be too. Thanks, George. His childhood nickname for her. How's Seattle? Rainy. But I'm coming to Denver next week. I want to see the new place. And maybe meet this woman you mentioned. Gary smiled. He'd recently started dating Amanda Tate, a flight instructor he'd met at a Pilots Association event. She was smart, funny, straightforward, and crucially, had her own money and career. No red flags, no ulterior motives. Just someone who liked him for him. She's great. You'll like her. After they hung up, Gary stood on his balcony, watching planes take off from DIA in the distance. Each one a potential adventure, a story, a life in transit. His phone buzzed with a news alert. Former pharmaceutical sales executive Roxanne Pace begins 25-year prison sentence. There was a photo of her in prison orange, her face haggard, aged beyond her years. Gary felt nothing. No satisfaction, no anger, no lingering pain. Just nothing. She was gone from his life, exactly where she deserved to be. A few weeks later, Gary was back in the cockpit. Flight 2847 to Miami again. Same route where everything had unraveled. Nate was his co-pilot, now more relaxed, more confident. Brings back memories, Nate said as they prepared for takeoff. Good ones, Gary replied. This is where I took my life back. Any regrets? Gary thought about the question seriously. 8 years with Roxanne. Years he'd never get back. The inheritance battles, the legal fees, the public spectacle of the trial. No, he finally said. No regrets. I learned who I really am when things go bad. I learned who my real family is. And I learned that I'm tougher than anyone, including me, gave me credit for. You're kind of a legend now, Nate said with a grin. Pilots at other airlines are calling you Captain Comeback. Gary laughed. Better than Captain Almost Murdered. As they lifted into the Denver sky, Gary felt the familiar peace that only came at altitude. Up here, everything made sense. Up here, he was in control. His phone buzzed with a text from Ernest. Final restitution payment processed. You're whole again, Gary. Congratulations. Another text from Amanda. Dinner tonight? I want to hear about your day. And one from Georgia. Love you, little brother. Proud of you every single day. Gary smiled and tucked his phone away. Below him, Denver spread out like a map of possibilities. His life was his own again. No lies, no manipulation, no poison. Just the sky, the controls in his hands, and the knowledge that he'd faced the worst betrayal imaginable and come out stronger. Roxanne and Maurice were in prison. Their carefully constructed con had collapsed. Their victim had turned the tables and destroyed them with their own evidence. Gary Conley had won, not through violence or revenge, but through intelligence, preparation, and the courage to fight back when everyone told him he was crazy. As the plane climbed through 10,000 feet, Gary made an announcement over the PA. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Conley. We've reached our cruising altitude. The weather is clear, the skies are friendly, and we're expecting a smooth flight. Sit back, relax, and enjoy your journey. And for the first time in a very long time, Gary Conley did exactly that. Epilogue. 3 years later, Gary married Amanda Tate in a small ceremony at a mountain resort. Georgia was the maid of honor. Spencer Wu gave a toast about second chances and the strength to rebuild. Gary had returned to flying full-time, became a senior training captain, and mentored young pilots like Nate. He'd written a book about his experience, Steady at Altitude, Surviving Betrayal and Finding Justice, that became a bestseller and helped other victims of domestic manipulation. Roxanne Pace remained in federal prison, her parole applications consistently denied. Maurice Taylor died of a heart attack, ironically, during his third year of incarceration. And Gary Conley flew on, literally and figuratively, proof that victims can become survivors, and survivors can become victorious. The sky remained his sanctuary. But now, his life on the ground was pretty damn good too. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.